Okay, just so we don't waste any time and we can maximize it at the end for questions, I am very excited to be here. Hello and good evening. I am Dr. Jessica Roberts. I am the Director of Habitat Connectivity here at Wild Virginia. I am super excited to introduce our guest speaker tonight. First, though, I am going to give a brief overview of Wild Virginia's habitat connectivity work so you can have that as we go through this webinar and connect it to Ben's work. So throughout reading this book, you may have read about some of the crossing research in Virginia. Ben's book really gets to the heart of a lot of the habitat connectivity work that we do here at Wild Virginia. So some things, if you're new to the topic, we just created Virginia's first ever habitat connectivity hub. Let me see, I'm going to put it in the chat for everyone. Here we go. So this is the Habitat Connectivity Hub that Wild Virginia created in partnership with Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridors Collaborative, and it's just to make habitat connectivity information in Virginia more accessible and transparent, so check that out. We also will be having a variety of webinars on how to use this hub to become a connectivity advocate and become just educated on the topic in general. So this is a link to our very first webinar on how to use this hub that will happen on February 6th. And also just to keep note, Wild Virginia is really helping lead the charge to get legislation passed in Virginia General Assembly. It's called Senate Bill 455, and it's to create a wildlife corridor grant fund to fund all these wonderful crossings and corridor projects in Virginia. So if you live in Virginia, please check out this legislation and contact your representatives in support of this bill. Also, if you just in general would like to get involved in this work, please go to wildvirginia.org to sign up for our newsletter. You can also contact me at jessica@wildvirginia.org. And please do think about donating to Wild Virginia so we can stay at the forefront of these issues. So now on to the really exciting stuff. I'm here to introduce Ben Goldfarb. He is an award-winning conservation journalist whose work has appeared in publications including The Atlantic, National Geographic, and the New York Times. He's the author of the book Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter, and also the book of Why We're Here Today, Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, which was actually named one of the best books of 2023 by New York Times. So throughout this webinar, we're going to go into this book, Crossings, and it's Ben Goldfarb's journey throughout the United States and the globe, unraveling the profound impact of roads on our planet and the innovative solutions proposed by road ecologists to mitigate the ecological damage by these roads. So similar to a lot of the work that we do here at Wild Virginia. So before I take it away, Ben, I'm just going to say we have to interact with Ben. Please do use the Q&A, not the chat. So please, at any time during the webinar, you can submit your questions to Ben via this Q&A. We are going to sift through them and I will ask Ben for you. And we're going to try to get through as many as possible at the end of the webinar. So thank you so much for being here and take it away, Ben.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Jess, for that introduction. Thanks to you all for being here. I see a couple of names in the attendee list who actually helped me with this book. So thanks very much to Bridget and the other folks who were involved in this process. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So this book and the talk that I'll be giving tonight is about this concept of road ecology, which is basically the science of all of the many different ways that roads and really all of our transportation infrastructure shape nature. And, you know, roads are so powerful and transformative in large part because there are so many of them, right? There are something like 4 million miles of road here in the US, around 40 million miles around the world, and about 15 million miles more that are in the process of being built or will be built by the middle of this century. So we're in the middle of what scientists have called an infrastructure tsunami, this wave of new construction that's headed for places like Nepal and Myanmar and India and Kenya. So the point is, we've got a lot of roads and we're building a lot more, right? And of course, roads are really useful. We use them to get to grocery stores and schools and hospitals. And I think in part because they're such daily features of our lives, we don't think about them very much, right? They're kind of invisible to us. And when we do think about them, I think we think about them mostly in fundamentally positive terms. Writers like Jack Kerouac and musicians like Bruce Springsteen, have celebrated the romance of the open road, right? Roads and highways especially are these symbols of freedom and movement and mobility and human connectivity, which is somewhat ironic because, of course, they're doing the exact opposite for wild animals, right? They're curtailing animal movement and freedom and mobility. And, I think perhaps in part because we just see so much of it, we really ignore or overlook the toll that roads take. We don't think about roads in the same terms as we think about deforestation or climate change as one of the major drivers of wildlife decline and extinction. But there's literally nothing that we do that kills more animals than drive, right? Or at least more wild animals. We kill more than 1 million animals with our cars every day in the US. And of course, lots of those are common critters like white-tailed deer and raccoons and gray squirrels. But there are also plenty of rare and endangered species, like ocelots and Florida panthers and tiger salamanders and Hawaiian geese, for which roadkill is truly the primary existential threat to their persistence. And again, scientists have observed that roadkill is the leading direct human cause of mortality on land. Right? There's nothing that we do that kills more animals than drives. And we talk about the sixth extinction that we're in the middle of, or this mass biodiversity loss event. Right? Driving and roadkill is truly one of the primary factors there. And I think that in part the reason that roadkill is such a significant problem is that it really undermines evolution, right? You think about the kind of the defense mechanisms of so many of our most common beloved species, turtles that withdraw into their shells, or porcupines that bristle their quills, or skunks that spray, right? These are these kind of ingenious stand your ground strategies that have worked for thousands of years against coyotes and foxes and hawks and other natural predators. But when the predator is an F-150, barreling down I-64 at 70 miles an hour, the worst possible thing you can do is hunker down and stand your ground, right? So again, roadkill kind of takes these evolutionary adaptations that have arisen over millions of years and actually renders them not only moot but maladaptive. I find that kind of tragic to contemplate. So again, roadkill it's kind of the most conspicuous thing that roads do to nature, right? But it's really just the tip of the iceberg in a lot of ways, and again, this field of road ecology looks at all of these different connections. Roads are these vectors of invasive species. You have all kinds of non-native plants and animals that penetrate ecosystems along a grid, essentially. Here's one example. This is an old logging road in Montana that I visited. And, for many decades, logging trucks had transported the seeds of an invasive thistle along the logging road. And then they all sprouted at once. You have this kind of eerie purple stripe across the landscape, which is pretty wild to see. Roads are these zones of erosion, right? Especially dirt roads. You get a big rainfall or snow melt event out here in Colorado where I live, and that dirt surface just turns liquid, and all of that sediment pours into fish streams and smothers eggs and larvae, and and results in major aquatic die-offs. So roads are contributing huge amounts of sediment to ecosystems. They're also sources of pollution, right? Our cars are sort of hemorrhaging cadmium and zinc and copper and microplastics. There's old residual lead in the soil from the days of leaded gasoline. One kind of fascinating road ecology study that came out a couple of years ago was about tire particles, and how tire particles there's something like 6 million tons of tire particles that enter waterways every year. And those tire particles contain 6 ppd, which is basically a chemical that's added to tires to protect the tires from ozone, and turns out to be killing salmon at enormous rates, right? And again, this is a chemical that nobody had ever heard of a couple of years ago, and yet it's this huge contributor to fish die-offs. So we're learning more all the time, right, about what our roads are doing to nature. One of the primary forms of kind of chemical pollution that roads create is road salt, right? We apply 20 million tons of road salt to American highways every year as a de-icer. And of course, all of that road salt basically runs off into rivers and lakes and streams and turns freshwater brackish. It also becomes a serious attractant to wild animals, right? Those strips of salt that line so many highways, animals love salt. And so you get, deer and these are bighorn sheep in British Columbia and all kinds of critters coming down to the roadside for that artificial salt lick. And of course, that's a really dangerous place for wild animals to be. I will say briefly that that road salt attractant phenomenon inspired my favorite road sign, which you see in Jasper National Park in Canada every winter, which says, "Do not let moose lick your car." I'm not sure that you could stop a moose from licking your car. I think if a moose wants to lick your car, it's probably gonna lick your car. But you can try. That's not a problem you guys have in Virginia, fortunately. Roads are also kind of these hellscapes of noise pollution, right? All of our vehicle engines and tires are just distributing noise into the environment and chasing animals away from places that they'd like to live, right? If you're a meadowlark, who has to attract a mate by singing, but your mates can't hear you over the the noise of traffic, you functionally can't live in that place, right? So noise pollution is truly a form of habitat loss for so many of these acoustically sensitive species. And I just wanted to play one quick video that I think illustrates this phenomenon of road noise as habitat loss, because I think it's one that we don't often think about. All right, so check out those bears just fleeing the instant that they hear the noise pollution of that ATV, right? So again, road noise. I think it's this thing we're so awash in all the time we don't really notice it, and yet it is this enormous form of habitat loss. But it's not entirely doom and gloom, right? Roads, like any ecosystem, create winners as well as losers, right? I visited this highway overpass in Minnesota, and there was this huge colony of little brown bats that were roosting in the crevices of the overpass. That was a case in which human infrastructure was creating habitat, not just destroying habitat. Another example of that, right, are many pollinating insects. Some of our last strips of native prairie in this country are those roadsides that are, the largest form of public land in many states. And they're some of the only areas that haven't become, monocultural lawns or corn farms, right? And so lots of pollinators like monarch butterflies actually, use those roadsides as habitat. But of course, that's a dangerous place to live, right? And there is always a risk of the road becoming an ecological trap, luring animals in and then potentially killing them. You see that with scavengers as well, right? Bald eagles, golden eagles, ravens, magpies, crows, all of these scavenging birds that come to feed on, deer and other species along the highway. It's really an important resource. Certainly black vultures, in Virginia would be another great example of that. But obviously, if you're a bald eagle with a belly full of venison, it takes you a little while to achieve liftoff, and you're at risk of being hit by a car yourself. So again, roads are these ecosystems and habitats in their own right, but they're fundamentally very dangerous ones. And they're also dangerous to humans as well, right? All of this roadkill we've been talking about, these large animal collisions are profoundly problematic for us drivers as well as for the animals themselves. And of course, that's epitomized by deer, right? White-tailed deer in Virginia, mule deer out in Colorado where I live. And I think in part maybe because these collisions are so common, we don't really think about them as being the hugely significant public health and safety crisis that they are. But we know that there are up to 2 million large animal collisions in the United States every single year, right? So that's one every 30 seconds, I think, something like that. So many dozens in the span of this webinar alone. Those collisions cost something like $9,000 per incident these days in, hospital bills, insurance costs, vehicle repairs, tow trucks, et cetera, et cetera. They kill between 200 and 400 drivers every year. So again, a very dangerous event. And Virginia, of course, is always one of the kind of the epicenters of this problem. There are just so many white-tailed deer, of course, in suburban Virginia. And Bridget Donaldson, who's on this call, told me that she calculated that these deer vehicle collisions, DVCs, were costing Virginia more than $500 million every year, right? So just this enormous, again, public health and safety crisis that we don't really think about. And again, deer are something like $9,000 per incident. There are bigger animals out there too, right? There are lots of elk here in Colorado where I live. Those are $20,000 or so per incident. Moose are more than $40,000. Just mostly reflecting they're so large that they just have much higher human hospitalization and fatality rates. Incidentally, I was in Alaska this past summer in Nome, and I saw a musk ox crossing the road. And I have no idea what the average cost of a musk ox collision is. Nobody's calculated that, but that's an animal you definitely wouldn't want to hit, right? So again, these are very dangerous, expensive problems. And historically, most transportation departments have dealt with this problem primarily by putting up deer signs, right? You've all seen 10 million of these things. And I'll just tell you empirically what you've probably intuited, which is that these things do not work, right? There are just so many of them that they're essentially visual pollution along our roadsides. There's lots of research basically showing that drivers habituate to them pretty quickly. Often you see signs like this, deer crossing next 30 miles, and what driver is going to be vigilant for the next 30 miles, right? So again, lots of research showing that the standard signs are not effective. Nevertheless, you see signs for every creature under the sun out there. I was down in ocelot country this spring in Texas, and lots of ocelot signs. And again, there's no reason to think that an ocelot sign works any better than a deer sign. And in fact, I've heard wildlife biologists call signs litter on sticks, which I think kind of gets at their uselessness pretty nicely. And I think that another important thing about signs, right, is that even if they theoretically did work, even if they prevented drivers from hitting animals, those collisions, the impact between car and animal is really only half of the problem, right? The bigger problem in a lot of cases is that constant stream of traffic that prevents animals from getting where they need to go. This loss of habitat connectivity that Jess was talking about in the introduction to this talk. And I just wanted to show one quick video that I think illustrates just how difficult it can be for animals to cross roads, even when there's relatively good driver awareness. So this is a video. This is in Wyoming. This is a herd of mule deer trying to cross a relatively low traffic highway in Wyoming. Right, so she turns around, she doesn't feel comfortable crossing. There's that really dangerous moment there. No deer die in this video, by the way. I'll just put your mind at ease. So there's a nice long gap in traffic, and and these guys make it across without too much difficulty. And then here's another, really dangerous incident, right? Another near miss. So anyway, you get the idea, right? It's difficult for animals to fluidly cross these roads, and many are not able to make the trip, right? Because I think that's an important point. Is that look, this is a rural 2-lane highway in Wyoming with probably 2,000 or 3,000 cars a day. It's not a big interstate highway, right? But those bigger interstates, or any state or federal highway on the East Coast, roads with more than 10,000 vehicles per day are basically absolute barriers to most wildlife, right? Animals aren't necessarily getting hit by cars; they're just not able to successfully cross at all. They're being repelled by that wall of traffic. And I think in many cases, this wall of traffic, the moving fence, as it's been called, is almost worse than roadkill itself, right? And here's just one sort of case study that illustrates that point. So working on this book, I went to visit this herd of deer in the Red Desert in southwestern Wyoming, and you can see that here are the wildlife biologists putting a collar on one of these deer, a satellite collar, releasing her back into the wild. And so these researchers have been monitoring this herd of deer for a very long time, and here's one image, I think, that really illustrates the problem they've documented. So all of those purple blotches on the screen, right, those are all mule deer locations, right? That's where the satellite collars have documented these animals going. And running across the bottom of the screen is I-80, right, the big interstate highway that cuts across the country. And you can see that deer basically never successfully cross that highway, right? All of the purple blotches, for the most part, are north of the highway because there's just so much traffic that the deer can't make it across. And as a result, during harsh winters, up to 40% of this deer herd will starve en masse because they can't access all of the really good, snow-free, low elevation food to the south of the highway, right? So again, that's almost a worse problem than roadkill. A herd of deer can handle a few collisions. What they can't handle is losing access to all of that critical habitat, right, and starving as a result. Here's another map that kind of illustrates a similar concept. This is these are the points of a young male grizzly bear in Montana. This is I-90 crossing the state of Montana, and every single red X is a point where that grizzly bear approached the highway and basically bounced off like a ping pong ball. So that's more than, I think that's 44 separate crossing attempts in the span of about 6 months before this bear was finally able to make it through a bridge on the far left-hand side of the screen there. But you can just see, that this road, right, this highway is, probably 150 feet wide from shoulder to shoulder, and yet it's denying animals access to millions of acres of habitat in some cases. And certainly this is happening all over the country, right? So again, roadkill is just the tip of the iceberg. You don't see the animal that attempts to cross but fails repeatedly and doesn't meet a mate as a result of that. So how do we handle this kind of dual linked problem of wildlife vehicle collisions, roadkill, and habitat connectivity and fragmentation caused by our roads? How do we, as drivers, keep going safely while getting the animals safely from one side of the road to the other? And, really the best tool at our disposal, right, are wildlife crossing structures, overpasses, underpasses, tunnels, all of these different structures that allow animals to safely navigate our highways. And this idea of wildlife crossings really began in Europe in the 1950s. France built some of the first. Germany, Austria, Switzerland followed. These days, the best country when it comes to this sort of thing is really the Netherlands. They have the highest, they're just great engineers in general, right? And they have the highest sort of density of wildlife crossing structures of any country in the world. And here's just a beautiful Dutch overpass whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce, but basically spans 2 lanes of the highway, a railroad, a sports complex, and a business park. So this is a half a kilometer, maybe a whole kilometer long. Just a really impressive structure. In the place that wildlife crossings sort of became famous and were really, I think, sort of empirically proven to be highly effective. We're in Banff National Park in Canada, where they started building wildlife underpasses in the 1980s and then overpasses in the 1990s over the Trans-Canada Highway, this giant cross-country highway that runs right through the middle of Banff National Park. And those overpasses especially were really built for grizzly bears. Grizzly bears had been sort of genetically fragmented by the Trans-Canada Highway. Males and females couldn't really find each other to mate because they just had this giant freeway running through the middle of their habitat. And what these researchers demonstrated beautifully over the course of many years, were these animals learning to use these structures, teaching their cubs how to use them, right? So you get these sort of intergenerational families, females with cubs going back and forth to mate on either side, and these overpasses basically healing this, genetic wound that the Trans-Canada Highway had inflicted. So it was really Banff National Park, I think, that helped to make wildlife crossings so prevalent. Here in the U.S., most of the first wildlife crossings were built in the western United States, in places like Wyoming, Colorado, Utah. And the reason for that is that out here in the West, we tend to have migratory animals, right? We have these big herds of deer and elk and antelope, that are moving in large numbers along very predictable routes, between sort of winter and summer ranges. And so, when you get 1,000 mule deer crossing a highway in the same place year after year after year, and 50 of them get hit, there's this big pile of carcasses, saying, hey, put the wildlife crossing right here, right? And so it was those western states that really had these kind of discrete hotspots to address, and started building passages for animals, really in the 1970s and 80s. But that's not to say that places like Virginia can't deal with this problem. We'll talk about that in a second. But the Western states have sort of traditionally been the leaders in this field, but that's changing. I think a really important point about wildlife crossings, right, is everybody likes to focus on the big, beautiful overpasses, the structures themselves. But the thing that makes those structures effective are the fences, right? You need the fences along the highways, basically guiding the animals to the passages. That deer is trying to cross the highway. He, bumps into the fence, paces the fence line for, a half a mile, and then all of a sudden, hey, there's a beautiful wildlife overpass or underpass for him to use. So again, the fences don't get a lot of attention or love, but they're really integral to making the crossings themselves functional. Another important piece of this whole sort of infrastructural medley or jump outs, right? They're these one-way escape ramps that some of you have maybe seen and wondered, what the heck are those things? We've got a lot of them along our highways out here in Colorado. And basically the idea there is that if a deer somehow does get through the fence and finds herself trapped on the highway, she can find that one-way escape ramp and basically jump out of the highway corridor and be, back on the right side of the fence. So, those jump outs are another sort of, I think, underappreciated but really important aspect of these wildlife crossing networks. And I think one important thing to remember about wildlife crossings, right, is that ideally they serve lots of different species. Historically we've kind of built them for deer and elk, the big animals that really mess you up when you hit them, right? But there are so many other species out there that we have to think about, including smaller critters, like rodents and mustelids, weasels and snakes and lizards, right? And one of the cool trends that we're starting to see now in wildlife crossing construction is building different structures for different animals, right? And one of my favorite sort of groups of wildlife crossings is in Washington State, just very close to Seattle on I-90, and there they've got a bunch of different structures, I think 20 or so. There's this big beautiful overpass that gets a lot of elk use, but here you can see they've also added all of these logs, right, which provide sort of micro habitat for smaller creatures as well. They've got these big open span underpasses that get lots of use by cougars and other cats who tend to prefer going under to going over. There's this this beautiful rock pile here that's great habitat for rodents and reptiles and stuff. They've got some beautiful stream crossings that get lots of use from otters and beavers and mink and other kind of riparian mammals, right? So they're just thinking about the whole ecosystem and building structures that accommodate all of these different creatures we have to think about. And I just wanted to show you one quick video that kind of illustrates this concept. This is up on I-90 just outside of Seattle, and you can see all of the different animals using these crossings. Rabbit. deer going over the overpass, right? There's a cougar going under an underpass. Mother and calf elk. It's always nice to see. It's a coyote. And then those are otters going through one of the stream crossings, right? So just you get the idea. But it's just, it's just cool to see all of the different members of the ecosystem, using these different structures, and how Washington's accommodated them. So, one of the common objections you hear to wildlife crossings is, wait a second, aren't they really expensive? These days, typical wildlife overpass is going to run you something like $5 to $10 million, and that seems like a lot of money to help a bunch of deer cross a highway, right? And sometimes they get criticized as being these frivolous expenditures. But I think a really important thing to remember is that because these crossings with the fences are preventing so many of those dangerous, expensive crashes that we were talking about earlier, they often pay for themselves very, very quickly, right? Through collision avoidance. And just one example of that, this is a wildlife overpass in Wyoming that was built for antelope and deer. And this was, again, a multi-million-dollar structure. All of the sort of local fiscal conservatives were sort of up in arms about this idea. But of course, within 5 years, it had paid for its own construction by preventing something like 70 collisions per year, paired with a couple other underpasses nearby. And so together, these crossings were preventing, again, 70 to 80 crashes every year, which is a lot of savings. Of course, one of the problems with having this kind of cost-benefit oriented approach, right, is that here in the U.S., we've really tended to build wildlife crossings for those larger animals, right? For those deer and elk especially, because again, those are the animals that potentially kill you if you hit them. And transportation departments, I think, very rationally are concerned about driver safety and that kind of cost-benefit analysis. But that also means that we haven't thought enough, I don't think, about the smaller critters, right? The amphibians, the reptiles, the rodents, the animals that you don't total your car when you hit one, but are sort of existentially threatened by roads and traffic. And here's one example of that. This is a group of northern red-legged frogs. This is a little population I visited in Portland, Oregon, and every sort of warm, wet night during the spring and fall, there were volunteers out there with buckets, picking these frogs up as they try to cross the road and ferrying them, from side to side. And it's really, it's a beautiful, heartwarming thing, right? But ideally, those frogs wouldn't have to get plopped into buckets and carried across the highway. Ideally, they'd have a culvert or an underpass that they could use. But it's been hard to convince lawmakers to spend a couple of $1 million on a frog underpass, right? So I think we need to sort of broaden our circle of concern a little bit, and think more about some of these smaller species. And that, again, that's not to say that we haven't done it. Certainly there are salamander tunnels and toad culverts and turtle passages scattered throughout the United States. But, again, these are some of the most critically endangered species we have, and, we've got to be thinking more about them. I'll point out that other countries, are sort of better about this in some ways than I think we are. You see a much greater diversity of wildlife crossings outside of the U.S. Here's a very famous one for migratory land crabs on Christmas Island that gets used by millions of crabs every year. And it's sort of hard to imagine the U.S. building a big crab crossing, but we can dream. Lots of countries also have arboreal crossings, right? These kind of canopy crossings that go from treetop to treetop across highways, for all of these tree-dwelling animals that aren't going to descend to the ground to use a traditional underpass, but still need to connect between forest fragments, right? So here's a beautiful canopy crossing for squirrel gliders, a little Australian marsupial, and I've seen them for sloths in Costa Rica, and there are many, there are a million of these in Brazil, which has really high primate diversity. And look, here in the U.S., right, we have plenty of arboreal mammals ourselves. We've got pine martens and flying squirrels and porcupines. These are all critters that would benefit from some canopy connectivity. But again, we haven't really done this sort of thing yet, and I'd love to see us think a little bit more about it. So in addition to building wildlife crossings for a greater diversity of species, right, we also just need a lot more of them and in a lot more places, and here's sort of one archetypal wildlife crossing that's being built right now, a really the most ambitious one ever constructed, I think, in some senses, which is being built in just outside of Los Angeles for mountain lions, right? And here you can see this is a kind of another classic example of fragmentation. Each little colored cluster is a different mountain lion with satellite color. And you can see that these animals basically never cross these red lines, which are the freeways, right? And so as a result, these mountain lions in the Santa Monica Mountains have been essentially isolated, right? They're sort of on this little island of habitat in this sea of freeways and development. And as a result, no new mountain lions can enter the population. So these animals, unfortunately, have been stuck mating with their own daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters because they can't mingle with cats elsewhere in California. And as a result, they've become chronically inbred, and they've entered what scientists call an extinction vortex, this kind of long-term doom spiral if nothing is done, right? But fortunately, something is being done. Right now, the state of California, in partnership with a bunch of nonprofits, is building this, giant $90 million wildlife overpass that will reconnect that little fragment of habitat with the rest of California and allow all of these mountain lions to kind of mingle with unrelated cats and refresh that gene pool to save them, right? And again, this is a crazily ambitious project, right? This is 10 lanes of traffic, 300,000 cars a day, the busiest freeway in America, and yet we're building a wildlife crossing over it, right? So if we can build a wildlife crossing over the 101, the busiest freeway in America, there is no highway in Virginia or anywhere else that we can't address in some way, right? And fortunately, we have more money for these structures now than we ever have, right? I mean, that's been sort of traditionally what's limited the construction of wildlife crossings is a lack of funding. But happily, the 2021 federal infrastructure law included a $350 million pot of funding for new wildlife crossings, which is very exciting. And actually just the first round of grants got announced in December, just a couple of months ago. And Virginia got a grant, I think it was $600,000 or so, to basically begin the planning process and figure out, okay, where are we going to put some of these crossings? So it's starting to happen. A lot of that money went to the western states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Montana, that have done a lot of this work already. But Virginia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Missouri also got these planning grants as well. So there's increasing interest in eastern states in doing this sort of work, which is really exciting to see. I'll also point out that it's not just the terrestrial animals, right? Fish also need safe passage. Every place where a stream crosses a road is potentially a place where aquatic connectivity is lost. Fish have to swim through these narrow little culverts, right? These pipes that you see, and sometimes those culverts are so narrow that they basically concentrate the stream like a fire hose and just blast the fish away. So actually, the Infrastructure Act also has $1 billion for new culverts that don't impede fish passage. And Virginia also got a grant in the first round of that funding as well for a culvert somewhere along the coast that's blocking herring and other kind of anadromous sea-run fish. So that's pretty exciting to see. And this is just, sort of what that looks like in practice, right? This is just, a place, this is outside of Seattle, a stream that used to go through a very narrow, corrugated metal pipe. They tore that pipe out, put in one of these big open span box culverts. And in the bottom left, there's the chum salmon that's about to go up that stream through that culvert to spawn, right? So that's pretty exciting to see. So these aren't the sexiest projects. That's just like a concrete rectangle, and yet they're sort of integral to reconnecting aquatic ecosystems as well. Also point out, that these culverts, while we're talking about them, are, they're good for fish connectivity, at least when they're done well, but they're also really good for wildlife connectivity, right? A lot of these culverts, these pipes, they weren't built with animals in mind, but animals are kind of endlessly creative and intelligent, and they've learned how to use them, right? And here's just here's my favorite culvert video that maybe some of you guys have seen. This is out in California a couple of years ago. So that's a coyote and a badger cooperatively hunting, right? The coyote chases the rodent, the badger digs him up, and they're using a culvert to cross this highway together, which is pretty cool to see. So again, in this country, we probably have, 2,000 or so dedicated wildlife crossings. We probably have about 2 million culverts, that could be put to use as wildlife crossings potentially, and that animals are already using. Anyway, very cute. And here's just, kind of one neat example of how we can put those culverts to use as effective wildlife crossings. This is what's known as a critter shelf. This is out in Montana, but there are a bunch of these in New York now and elsewhere. And basically, here's a culvert under a road, and the culvert sort of gets naturally used by bobcats and skunks and all kinds of critters. But in the spring, when the water is high, the bottom of the culvert is flooded, right? And the animals don't want to use the culvert. So they put in these critter shelves, these little catwalks, which wildlife can use even when there's water at the bottom of the culvert, right? So again, not every wildlife crossing has to be a $90 million overpass. There's a lot we can do with existing infrastructure through these little retrofits and tweaks and whatnot. And I wanted to just conclude by telling one quick story that Bridget Donaldson told me about Virginia, about a place where some of this existing infrastructure, these culverts, have really been put to good use, and that's on I-64, where there were a couple of existing crossings, right? There's one old box culvert that I think a dairy farmer used to herd his cows through. Then there was one sort of natural stream crossing, and so again, these weren't dedicated wildlife crossings, right? But they were these passages that animals, were using to some extent. So, what Bridget and VDOT did was basically fence off the highway off I-64 adjacent to the crossings, right? Basically saying, hey, we have these natural crossings here. We're going to prevent animals from crossing over the surface of the road, and we're going to funnel them. We're going to guide them, to these underpasses, and we're going to turn these underpasses into real wildlife underpasses with some fencing, right? So again, not a very expensive project, not a $90 million overpass, and yet incredibly effective. What Bridget found was that there's more than a 90% reduction in crashes at these sites, right? Because again, you're just keeping deer off the highway, which is great. The deer became much more likely to use that culvert in these crossings because, again, they can't cross over the highway. They have to go through the underpass, and so the deer, they just figure it out, right? And also black bears and foxes and all kinds of critters also use these crossings. And Bridget showed me some great pictures of adult animals teaching their cubs and fawns and kits to use these things, right? So you get this cool, again, kind of intergenerational knowledge transfer. And this fence, which was pretty inexpensive to construct, prevented enough crashes that it recouped its own costs in less than 2 years, right? So again, it's not just good for conservation; it's also good for our bottom line, which is certainly why a lot of transportation departments, including VDOT, are interested in these kinds of solutions now, right? So not every crossing has to be a giant overpass. There's a lot we can do with the existing infrastructure that's already on the landscape, and I think that's exciting. So ultimately, the task before us is really to remake our infrastructure, right? Again, I think we tend to overlook roads and railroads and other, and dams and other infrastructure as sort of a primary cause of wildlife decline and even extinction. But, if we're going to save biodiversity on this planet, we have to think about our infrastructure. Here's just one example of that. This is an underpass that was built for ocelots in Texas. And, ocelots are maybe the rarest mammal that we have in the United States. There are less than 100 ocelots left. And something like 40% of ocelots die when they're hit by cars, right? It's truly an existential threat to our population. This is a species that is not going to survive the Anthropocene, unless we help them by modifying our infrastructure, right? So that's the task before us is basically to do nothing less than to remake our built environment. No big deal, right? I'll briefly say that if this conversation inspired you or interested you to learn more about this topic of road ecology, I do have a new book out on this subject. Both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, among many other publications, loved it. So liberals and conservatives united it around the topic of habitat connectivity and wildlife vehicle collision prevention. And I know you'll all enjoy the book. I'll just say that I have these cool little signed book plates that I can personalize. So you're welcome to send me an email with sort of proof of purchase, and I'll get you a signed book plate. It would be my great honor. There's my email address. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much, and happy to take some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This is really wonderful. So we are going to go into questions now. And so please do, if you have a question for Ben, please submit it to our Q&A. So submit it to the Q&A, not to the chat. Please submit it to the Q&A. Okay, and so I'm going to start going through them now. So we have some book-related questions. So the first one is, how much time was required for the information gathering for this book?
Yeah, good question. Let's see. So I mean, my interest in this topic really began in 2013. I had the chance to tour some wildlife crossings in Montana on Highway 93 north of Missoula, some very famous wildlife crossings. And it was just incredibly exciting and inspiring. We obviously do so much on this planet to make animals' lives harder and more dangerous. And here were these beautiful multi-million-dollar structures we built to make their lives easier and safer. And so that was, it was really, it was 2013 that I really started thinking about this issue and topic. And then I started working on the book in earnest, I guess in sort of the fall of 2018, and then it was published in the fall of 2023. So yeah, sort of like 5 years of dedicated work on this topic.
Wow, yeah, that's super impressive. And then we have another one. So you did beavers and you did road ecology. So what is potentially next?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm taking suggestions. I have a couple of ideas that I'm kicking around with my agent and editor, and probably something in the realm of infrastructure and ecology again, because now I'm just excited about that sort of thing.
Wonderful. Okay. And then we have a very specific one. So I don't know if you're going to have an answer to this. And I'm not sure if I really have an answer to this one, but do you know throughout all of your research of anybody developing more efficient ways to bore underneath like highways to make it a little bit more cost efficient? Have you seen any like new technologies or anything?
Wow, it's so cool that Elon Musk is on this webinar. Um, yeah, no, it's a good question. I'm not up to date on tunnel technology, nor am I aware of any places where tunnels have been built to keep humans off the surface for the sake of wildlife. I mean, I will say that, that one thing that Florida has done a bit of, and you see a lot of in other countries, are actually elevated highways. You've got highways up on concrete pillars. So instead of having, a single narrow underpass, you've got sort of miles where animals can move back and forth beneath an elevated highway. So I think maybe that, yeah, that you definitely see that in a few places.
Yeah, that's very true. And I do have to say, for anything that we're doing here at Wild Virginia, based off of recent conversations with the folks that deal with a lot of the infrastructure improvements, boring underneath is still massively, massively expensive and very complicated of a task, but we are looking into it for some of our projects. So
And actually,
stay
in the
tuned for
in
those.
the in the in the chat, Bridget actually said that they looked into this in on I-64, and it's pricey but can be done. So
Okay, there we go. There's Bridget. She's honestly our infrastructure
yeah.
specialist. So there she is. We are looking into it for the Afton Gap. So connecting, we call it Afton Gap where I-64 is. So we are looking into that. So there we go. We have Bridget Donaldson. Thank you,
Cool.
Bridget. um, and let's see, we have a lot of thank yous, and we have not a question, but Richard says that they read it for their Blandy book club. So that's really great. A lot of thank yous. And then also, so we get this question a lot too, and I don't know if you've heard about this with other states, that insurance companies should want to be involved in this. So I don't know if you've heard throughout your travels, if you saw like maybe insurance companies want to invest in these types of overpass and underpass because they have to deal with the aftermath expenses of that. But I have an answer, but
Yeah, I'd like to hear your answer. I mean, I've definitely, I have certainly heard of them, advocating for and lobbying them, but I actually haven't heard of insurance companies putting their money where their mouth is and helping to fund them. Maybe you have some thoughts about that, Jess.
yeah, it was looked into in the past. I think with Virginia specifically, we needed more. This was before the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan came out, and we needed more of like a concrete plan of like where these crossings were going to go before we tried to solicit more private funding. So
Yeah.
now that we have more of a plan in place and we are starting to prioritize where these structures would go, that is a potential to look into in the future, and that's probably a lot of the work that I'm going to be doing. Um, awesome question. This one kind of goes a little bit in hand with this of like throughout maybe your travels, have you seen any creative things that people have done to reduce the overall cost of these structures or maybe the larger scale wildlife overpass structures? Have you seen anything?
Yeah, so so one of the there's a lot of materials research and experimentation in the works right now. There's a group called the Western Transportation Institute that's done. It's working on a pilot project right now involving a material type known as fiber reinforced polymers. And I'm not going to be able to explain effectively what those are because it's a good question for a material scientist or a chemist. But essentially, they're this material that can be it can be built out of basically anything. It's like essentially a plastic. That you can use recycled bottles. Even like some like vegetation like flax. Can be incorporated somehow. And basically the idea there, these FRPs are, they're sort of stronger, pound for pound than steel or concrete, and they will ultimately be cheaper. They have been used for some pedestrian overpasses in Europe, but there's planning underway for the first FRP. Wildlife overpass in California right now, and so lots of the road ecologists I've talked to are sort of like very excited about the potential for FRPs to reduce the costs of these projects. In part because they're sort of like you can make them in a modular way, so you can just snap them into place over a highway, very quickly, which reduces construction costs, obviously. And the cool thing about them too is that theoretically, if you can make them modular. You can also disassemble them, right? So you could imagine you've got a deer collision hotspot today that 10 years from now is 5 miles north due to climate change, and you can pick up that overpass and relocate it up the road. That's that sort of experiments in that arena are being sort of worked on right now as well. So that there are, yeah, I've talked to a lot of road ecologists who are sort of putting a lot of eggs in the fiber reinforced polymer basket.
Awesome. Yeah, I have heard of that. And I've also, if anybody if anybody's interested in this, looks up ARC Solutions. They have a lot of resources on this as well for the United States. So that's a great resource for looking up that too. And we are looking into that stuff for Virginia as well. Okay, so as we're getting down to it, I'm going to start kind of selecting from the questions that we have. This one's interesting. Um, you mentioned how highways helped to spread invasive plant species. Is plant biodiversity threatened by roads the same way wildlife is? If it is, are there projects like wildlife crossings in development to help with plants in some kind of way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, certainly, plant biodiversity is threatened by roads. We mentioned those invasive plants that in many cases are squeezing out natives. There are cases of fungal diseases that have been transmitted along road networks that are killing cedar trees in Oregon, for example. I'll also point out that obviously plants are dependent upon animals, right? As pollinators and seed dispersers, and they need birds as insect pest controllers. There's been some amazing research in Portugal, basically showing that noise pollution chases away songbirds from the roadside, which then allows insect pests to just decimate forests. And so there's this the kind of this road plant animal trophic cascade essentially happening. So in some senses wildlife crossings benefit plants as well, and I know that's a big I spent some time in Costa Rica and Brazil working on this book, and that's one of the primary reasons that they care about wildlife crossings, because they've got tapirs and other sort of megafauna that are so important as seed dispersers, and if they can't get those animals across highways, forests are at risk. So yeah, roads kind of affect everything.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to give you this good question, and then I think the rest of the questions I can answer with Wild Virginia's work. But so this is a great, where to go? I lost it for a second. There we are. So you undoubtedly met many proponents of wildlife crossings, but did you meet many skeptics because of the costs or feelings that it's just not doing the job of the whatever Department of Transportation's to build these structures? And do you see that the landscape is changing in any, like, our everybody's perception and attitudes towards these structures?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Bridget, you've been at this for longer than me, so you could probably answer your own question. I mean, to me, it certainly seems like mindsets are absolutely changing, especially within within DOTs, right? I mean, I think that historically, DOTs basically viewed their responsibility as getting drivers from point A to point B, and that's basically it. And now, I mean, I think that one important thing you're seeing is that this is certainly true out west. I can't really speak to to Virginia, but state transportation agencies and state wildlife agencies having much more partnership and cross pollination, right? Which is really exciting to see. Here in Colorado, Colorado Parks and Wildlife and CDOT, have become, I think, really good partners at, identifying hotspots and mitigating them together. And my sense is that, 10 or certainly 20 years ago, that wasn't the case, that those agencies tended to be siloed. So, I do think that there is a lot of progress being made. I mean, as for the skeptics, I mean, certainly you always hear people, sort of grumbling about costs. There's also a little bit of political skepticism too. In the course of working on this book, I went to, and I met a couple of folks in various communities out west, who basically viewed, wildlife crossings as sort of like this big government overreach thing, that was, yeah, and some of it was sort of like conspiratorial, but some of it, was sort of like legitimate concerns I thought about, like the impact of, fences on local view sheds. So, obviously, as you all know, these projects tend to be really nonpartisan, right? I always feel like wildlife crossings are, one of the only environmental issues that both the Humane Society and the hunting lobby support. But there are some little pockets of resistance out there, and that's just something to be aware of.
Amazing. Thank you. So I think that is all the time we have for questions for Ben. If you have any questions, I'm seeing a lot of people asking what's kind of being done in Virginia. So if you didn't catch it at the beginning, I'm going to put in the chat the Virginia's Habitat Connectivity Hub. It's a one-stop shop for all information on habitat connectivity in Virginia that Wild Virginia helped put together with the Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridors Collaborative. So please check that out if you need more information, and email me or Ben if you have any burning questions, or email me if you want to get involved with this work in Virginia, where we have a whole section of it here at Wild Virginia. So please check out the hub, and we are so thankful to Ben for being here and giving this really wonderful webinar. If you look in the chat, Ben, we see so many thank yous to you. And really just keep up your really wonderful work for conservation.
Well, thank you so much, Jess. Thanks to everyone for hanging out with the great questions. And yeah, appreciate all you guys are doing for habitat connectivity in Virginia. It means a lot. And it's just so exciting to see all the progress that you guys are making. So keep it up.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. And Ben, I will connect with you over email. Okay, thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.